Hey there, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to take apart a Ford C6. Now this transmission is going to be a little bit different than the other C6 I have on the channel as far as teardowns are concerned, in that this is out of an FE series truck from 1972. So it's a 391 engine and it has what's called a fixed yoke design. And so those are a little bit different. At least I've not personally seen one before. A fixed yoke design is such that it has a bolt-on yoke on the back that's splined onto an output shaft that has, I want to say, 10 splines. So it's not a slip yoke, it's bolt-on. There's a 1.5 inch nut that has to come off that you'll see in a little bit. But anyway, there's also going to be another fundamental difference between this video and all my other teardown videos, in that I always say in a lot of my videos, not just the ones where I'm ripping apart a transmission, in that you don't want to do your real inspection until after all your parts are cleaned up. So I've said that off and on numerous times in multiple videos, so I figured instead of just talking the talk, it's time to walk the walk. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take the transmission apart. I'm not going to cover any of the points of inspection until I have everything clean. So I'll focus on things like orientation and case architecture. We'll point out some differences between this C6 and some of the other variants that have been produced over the years. This is an early model unit, so it'll give us an opportunity to compare and contrast some of the key differences and engineering changes that were made in, I believe, May of 1976. So for those that are not super familiar with Ford C6s, I recognize two distinct generations of those transmissions. There's a Gen 1 and a Gen 2, and the demarcation line is May of 1976, where a whole host of changes went into this unit that Ford made. So we'll cover those and point out a few other things that you need to know when it comes to considerations for reassembly. But once I have everything apart, I will go ahead and clean everything up, and then at that point we'll bring you back for the second half of the video and then do a thorough visual and physical inspection of all of the case components. So that's how we'll proceed, so let's begin. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have the bolt-on yoke here. This is a 1.5 inch nut. I'm going to be taking it off with a 1.5 inch 3/4 drive snap-on socket and a 1/2 to 3/4 adapter. And so hopefully that'll work. We have a speedo housing here. This is 7/16. And then for these FE series cases, the hallmark physical characteristic of them is the rounded bell housing. Okay, none of the other variants have a bell housing that is almost perfectly circular like this. So pumps largely the same, input shaft, all that good stuff. It's going to have the same kind of servo assembly. I'll talk a little bit more about servo upgrades and an important thing you need to know when it comes to running sonic servos and older C6s when we get there. But other than that, the general architecture of the unit is largely the same as any other Ford C6. Alright, let me make sure this is in park. So one thing you want to do, even before I start taking stuff off, is when you have a transmission, especially if you don't know the history of the unit, go ahead and grab the output shaft and hold it and then spin the input shaft. Now you want to spin the input shaft forwards and backwards all the way around, one complete revolution. And then you can do the same with the output shaft. Okay, you should be able to spin each of these shafts independently of each other while you're spinning one and holding the other. Okay, they shouldn't want to spin in unison. If they do, and if you're spinning the input shaft and the output shaft is trying to force its way out of your hand, then chances are there's something seriously wrong inside the case. So it's just a quick check you can do even before you lay money across the counter for a core or even a good used transmission, if that's what you're trying to do. But you want to make sure that there's nothing grenaded in there before you take it home with you. Alright, let's see how this is going to go. This is held on with between 60 and 80 foot-pounds of torque. Alright. Okay, so this is either going to come out on its own, or I'm going to have to pull it off with like a puller or something. Alright, well, didn't need to do that. So here's the 10 splines, and then you have your threads. You just want to check your threads, make sure they're not boogered up. So this looks okay to me. Hey, extension housings, 9/16. And then, like I said earlier, the speedo is 7/16, so we'll take that off first. Alright, I want to check that, make sure that the teeth are in good shape. Alright, I'll talk about tooth counts in a little bit later, but like I said, I don't want to get too far into the weeds when it comes to looking at stuff right now. Alright, now we'll go ahead and remove the extension housing itself. Okay, these bolts are all the same length except for the two on the bottom that are typically shorter. And then this little bracket is for your vacuum line that runs from the modulator up to the engine. So it's usually like a steel line, and then you have a section of hose that goes from the steel line, which comes up to about right, I don't know, here or so, and then it'll go right to the engine. Now grab me an extension. That's not gonna work. Alright, I'm going to have to move this closer to the edge so that I can get at it. Okay, so on these, you have a roller bearing. You have the roller bearing, and then the shaft is captured. So once we take this seal off, we'll have the speedo gear, and then there's a snap ring that holds the bearing in place. So this is actually reminiscent of a 5R110. It is not unlike those units. So the governor is going to be bolted to the back. It's going to be bolted to the back of the governor support. And then now all we have here is the oil distributor that has to come off, and then we can take off the parking rod guide bolts and get the guide out of the way. So 1/2 inch on all these bolts here. And then for the modulator, these are a screw on, screw off variety. Okay, and then there's a little gasket that goes right here, and these gaskets come in the kit. Okay, so you just want to take a screwdriver and gently pry outward so that you can clear both the parking pole and the parking gear, because that's going to come out with it. Maybe you want to take a finger here and just grab the gear. And then you have your guide pin, and then you have your two tubes, your distributor tubes themselves, that you want to be careful of. Okay, so again, you just want to be gentle when you pry outward. And they'll eventually come out. So you're going to have your thrust washer. Your thrust washer is going to go like this. And then your parking gear is going to orient this way. Alright, next we'll go ahead and remove the guide plate bolts. Hey, again, just make note of the orientation of these things. Alright, and for whatever reason has always kind of messed me up over the years until I've done enough of these, is the specific orientation of the return spring for your parking pole in relationship to the pole itself, the case, and the parking pole guide pin. So I'll zoom in on that real quick so you can see it. Alright, that's how it goes. I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, hokey, but it works. Alright, then you have your rear case gasket. Notice there's no RTV on this. You do not need RTV. A lot of guys that I've seen, whose cores I've torn down, will put RTV all over the surface here and all over the surface of the extension housing. It's totally unnecessary, and even worse, RTV bits and pieces will break off and will get into the inside of the transmission and cause all kinds of problems. Alright, the main concern you have with RTV is little bits of it clogging up or restricting lube circuits. So little holes where lube oil distributes through to gears and shafts and such. A lot of times that stuff will get in there and prevent that circulation from happening, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist or genius to figure out what will happen next. Alright, I'm gonna move the camera up a little bit. Alright, so right here is going to be your kickdown rod. So this actually had a nut and a little crush washer here. That's what goes. But I had to actually rob this core for another C6 because it came in without it, and that got done first. So I'll just go have to source one to replace the one I took from here. Here is your band adjustment screw, and then you have your nut. I mean, this transmission is absolutely filthy. I more than likely came from a junkyard, so this is what they all look like. Alright, I'm not going to take this out just yet. We'll just kind of show you what the band looks like so you can have a frame of reference. Like I said, if you're brand new to this unit and you've not watched any other videos before this one, this way you know. Okay, so here is your servo cover. Now, there are multiple different servo and cover combinations that were installed, each of them being a little bit larger or smaller than the others. Okay, you can tell what servo you have by looking for the alpha code. It's going to be one letter, and it's going to be in this location here. Sometimes it's in this location, but this one looks like it's in this location. And I'm able to see through all the crud here and get some of it out of the way. This looks like an L code servo, or maybe it's an I code. All right, I'll take the cover off and we'll bring it closer to the camera. Half inch on these bolts as well. Alright, so you're going to have your cover, your servo itself, and then your return spring. So there's the code, looks like an L. So when we talk about servo size, when it comes to C6s, and really when it comes to any servo, it's always going to be based on what we call the apply side of the servo. And the apply side is going to be right here. So it's this diameter that is referenced when we talk about size of servo. And there's a myriad of different sizes, like I mentioned, and it's all based on whatever application and whatever powertrain was overall installed into whatever vehicle, whether it be a car, truck, or SUV. And the largest size that came in any of these C6s, to my knowledge, was the R servo. And so we're going to be installing a Sonex R servo into this transmission. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there's one thing you need to keep in mind if you plan on using a Sonex servo. That servo will not be a drop-in install for any units, I believe, older than 1972 or 1971. And I'll annotate the video with the exact year. But there's a cutoff. Now, there is one exception to this. I think, as far as I know, it's only one, and that is in mid-68. There was a version or variant of the C6s that will allow that servo assembly to just install without any machining. So if you have a C6 and you want to use the Sonex servo, and that's a servo you want to go with, you're going to have to machine the servo, and Sonex gives you instructions on what the proper procedure is, and a specification for, I guess, what they're calling as surface smoothness, and then it has a rating and all that. But the bottom line is that you want to be cognizant of what year you're working on, so that you don't buy a servo that you can't use, at least not without some serious machine work. Alright, to my knowledge, the return springs are all the same. If we were going back together with this servo and this cover, in addition to cover being cleaned, we would install a brand new bonded steel and rubber servo piston. We would not reuse this one. Okay, I think that does it for everything that's on the outside of the case. You have cooler line fittings here. This is going to be your bleeder. You want to make sure that this is free of any kind of restrictions or anything that could potentially clog it up. Okay, for your pump, all these are going to be 1/2-inch bolts, so we can take these off now. You want to check your clearances with the pump. Make sure they're still within spec. After 40, 50 years or so, they can wear. Alright, spin this thing around and then we'll take the pan off and have a look at the valve body. So same deal, 1/2-inch bolts. Okay, so there were different versions of this pan. There was a shallow pan and a deep pan. Looks like these pan bolts are loose. Now when this thing came in, it was full of fluid. I mean, it was literally, pouring out of the dipstick tube port. So I'm not sure why the pan bolts are loose. somebody may have tried to service this thing recently, and for whatever reason the service maybe didn't work. Maybe it's burnt up inside, who knows. As you can see, the fluid is brand new. I mean, it doesn't smell at all. And we got a special bolt here on the back side, so I'll make note of that location. Maybe a helicoil repair was done on it, who knows. And it's also loose. And a little washer to it. And no magnet in the pan, and a cork gasket. See some kind of grayish material, and then we have a lot more grayish material on the bottom. I mean, it's not quite black, but I'm guessing at least one clutch, or maybe the band is worn. Like I said, it doesn't smell burnt. And the fluid is not, it's not laden with black burnt clutch material, but we'll see what we're up against once we get inside. Let me get this pan out of the way. A dirty, nasty specimen. Alright, so the valve body in these changed from early 76 to late 76. That had to do with the elimination of, or I should say, yes, the elimination of the check ball that is in the low reverse section, and they moved that check ball, or that one-way circuit, to the valve body post 76. So I'm going to actually take the valve body halves apart. I'm not going to take the valves out or anything, but we'll show you what the check ball configuration looks like in one of these earlier units, so you can compare or contrast that with what one from a later unit, say post 76, would look like. So all your valve body to case bolts are going to be 3/8. They're here, 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 and these two bolts are longer than the others. Alright, there's no check balls that are going to come flying out or anything like that. This assembly is, as far as check balls are concerned, is what I refer to as a closed case design. So in other words, all the check balls, valving, and everything else, little restrictors or whatever the case may be, are all encased in the assembly. Nothing's exposed to anything else. Okay, so valve body's off. Alright, now what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to remove all the 5/16 bolts that are holding the filter on, as well as the perimeter bolts here that hold the valve body to the spacer plate and to the channel plate. So you're going to have two more bolts underneath this filter, and then you have these two bolts here. So I'm actually going to start with these two bolts on this side because I want the valve body, when I take it, all those other bolts off, I want this side facing down because otherwise all the stuff's going to spill out. You'll have two check balls, you'll have your converter relief and your throttle relief. So all that stuff will come out. Alright, so 5/16 on every single one of these check balls. I'm sorry, bolts. Check balls. Bolts. And let me reposition the camera so I'm sure you're getting everything in the shot. Or I'm getting everything in the shot and you're seeing everything. Okay, do not remove any of the front plates. So you have your so-called banana plate here. This holds the majority of the valves in. Then you have a plate here, and you have a plate over here. Now, later model units, they did not have this plate. This is going to be your boost valve and your PR valve, pressure regulator valve that is, and these designs changed as well from valve body to valve body. So, kind of give you a close-up of Ford's legacy codification for date stamping everything. In fact, I might have to, I don't want to make a mess on the floor. Let me just position the camera so that you can see it, and you'll just be looking down on it. Alright, so here is the casting number. It's going to be rough foundry. That's what RF stands for. It stands for rough foundry. And then you're going to have an alphanumeric codification that follows. And the first 4 characters are what's important when it comes to identifying where this valve body came from, or where any part that Ford made during these, you know, those 4 decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where that part came from and what application, because that'll help you understand what it'll work with and, you know, maybe what it won't. So the letters here are D, starting with D, and then you have a number 2, and then you have an A, and then you have a letter P. So D indicates the decade, and that doesn't stand for D for decade, it just indicates the decade, and the rubric is as follows. Letter C equals 1960s, letter D equals 1970s, letter E equals 1980s, and letter F equals 1990s. So the number here, the integer, in this case a 2, is simply the year production within that decade. So D70s to 1972. A is the application code. So what model or submodel within Ford Motor Company's, you know, whole portfolio of vehicles took this particular part. A, I believe, just stands for Ford, so it's a generic. And that's true for a lot of the valve bodies you'll see. They just have the letter A in this 3rd position. And then P, you're going to see that for any part that came off of an automatic transmission, because P indicates Ford Motor Company's automatic transmission design group, and that is the engineering or design office within Ford that was responsible for developing and producing this part. So that's how you interpret that codification. Now in 1998 or 1999, Ford went away from that particular system, and they now use a system that's somewhat similar to GM, and it has, you know, a similar coding system, but it's not quite the same. So I don't want to get too far into it here, it's kind of off track, but just wanted to share that with you. Alright, if you ever use Transgo's shift kits for these, Transgo has like a bolt code, and they, you know, just simply use a simple letter to denote what bolt is, you know, indicated. So I think they have A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So the G bolts are the shortest, and then the A bolt is the longest. Okay. So I gotta take this thing apart anyway, so I figured why not get it partway done now. Okay, all these bolts should be the same length. Except for this one. This one's longer. So I believe this is the A bolt in Transgo's code system. I believe these are the C bolts, and then D bolts are slightly shorter. Alright, now you're going to think I'm crazy when I say what I'm about to say, but every once in a while I'll get a unit that comes in for overhaul that has been rebuilt in the past, and as in the recent past. It'll have aftermarket Transtech gaskets and, you know, signs that the parts were recently acquired, but you'll see the filter sometimes be reused. Now this filter is going to be replaced as I replace all my filters, but it's okay to reuse your filter if A, the filter's not damaged, there's no signs of, you know, dents. Like this looks like it's dented. I don't know how that happened, but that's what it looks like to me. But as long as it's free of any physical defects and you're able to clean the screen out, you know, I just spray it down with brake cleaner and everything else appears fine with it, and you clean it off, you could reuse it. Alright, just make note of where this little ID tag is placed. It's always going to be in this top left corner, based on the way the valve body is oriented right now. And there is a torque sequencing order for all these fasteners. Okay, so if you don't follow it, you run the risk of kind of imparting what I'll call unnatural stress on parts of the valve body, and that may cause an issue with you know, drivability symptoms, valves hanging up, you know, wrong gear starts, things like that. Alright, so all these bolts are the same length, except for this long one here. So if you want to keep track of your fasteners, the best thing to do, at least that I've found, is to just keep them separate and make note of what part of the assembly they came from. Alright, so you don't have to take the two retainer plates off now. I mean, you can if you want, but this is the channel plate. There's no check balls underneath, and then this is the spacer plate. Okay, so here is your converter relief. This is your throttle relief, and then there's a check ball here for your high clutch. Okay, it's your high clutch check ball. That goes right here. So here's your converter relief. Interesting, this yellow spring looks like a Transgo spring, but I don't see the poppet valve that Transgo gives you to put in lieu of the 1/4 inch check ball that goes there. As you can see, no other check balls. And later valve bodies, in this area here, in this general area, they had a check ball for low reverse. So that means that when we get to the case, you'll see the check ball there, you know, at the bottom of the case. Okay, here's your kick down valve, your manual valve, boost PR, and then all the rest of your valve trains. Okay, so these bolts here in the so-called banana plate, there are, I think, 2 different lengths of bolts here. So you just want to keep track of what length went where. And then same with these. You just want to keep track of what bolts went with what plate. Alright, let me get some of this fluid out of the way. So if you're going to build transmissions, it's ideal to have a bench that is sloped rearward, because that'll funnel all the fluid to the back trough, which then empties into a bucket, so that you don't have to worry about having to clean up all this nasty fluid all over the place. You know, I mean, with a trowel, it makes quick work, and you can get the bench cleaned off so that you can proceed. Alright, if you're going to do air checks, This is going to be your intermediate servo apply. This is going to be direct, forward, and then you have converter, and then back here is going to be your low reverse, and then you have your 2 governor feeds. Alright, we're not going to do that now. I did it in the teardown video of the other C6. So I also have a dedicated video to air checking these transmissions. It's a pretty straightforward deal. All you're listening for is anything unusual. So no apply or, weak apply, things like that. Alright, now it's time to remove the pump. I'm going to move the camera back just a little bit so that you can kind of see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to attach my pump removal tool. I found that for these, that's just the best way to get it out. I mean, it's a little cumbersome to deal with, but at the same token, it gets it out trouble-free, no issues, and we'll evacuate the rest of the case from there. Okay, pump removal tool in place. All we're going to do is crank down on the forcing screw and have the pump just come right out of the case. Now you'll hear it separate from the drum, and it will just come out little by little. And there's other ways of getting this thing out of here. I've seen some folks just kind of pry on the back of the shell once the band adjustment screw is removed, of course, and then that allows them to just free it up by force. I like to use this tool because it allows me to get a little bit more control of this pump. I mean, it's kind of heavy, and I don't want it smacking against the aluminum bell. I mean, I've never broken one of these like that, but still, there's always time for firsts. And I'm kind of clumsy, so as those that watch my channel, you already know that. All right, should be fully free. Okay. So drums are remaining inside the case, which is what I wanted. Get the pump the case gasket. See what selective washer we have. So this one's going to be a Babbitt / bronze style. Most of them are plastic, but here's the gasket. So this appears to be the original gasket. Like I said, it's a core, so neither I nor my customer have any real history on it other than here it is, what you see is what you get. But if it had the words Transtech written on the gasket, that would tell me that this was overhauled at some point relatively recently. Hey, here's the input shaft. So the short end of the splines faces out, long end faces in. Alright, let me get this off. Okay, these pump removal tools are available pretty much everywhere online. Sometimes transmission hard part suppliers will also sell tools, including something like this. They're very handy to have around. So if you work on transmissions a lot, I would recommend buying one. I didn't intend to take all of these fasteners off of here, so get this out of the way. Okay, the pump is held together by 5 half-inch bolts, so we'll go ahead and remove those. And then I'll measure the thickness of this so that we can record it. So the pump itself didn't change a whole lot over the years. I think in '88 they eliminated the drain back or something of that nature. But for the most part, it's largely remained the same. Looks decent. Like I said, we'll do our real inspection once it's clean. So pump gears. A little bit of light scoring, nothing major. Get these cleaned off as well. Let's take a look at the bushings. They're in good shape. I can't actually tell if they are original or not. They look original to me. They look factory, now that I'm looking at them a little bit more closely. Drain that oil. And you can remove the O-ring. The O-rings that come in the kit have a red stripe. This has a blue stripe. So if this was overhauled, I'm guessing it was a long time ago. Alright, let me see how thick this washer is. Focus is brutal. So it looks like we're sitting at 74 thousandths. So when I go back together with this thing, I'm going to have to actually bolt the whole assembly to the case before I do an end plate check for the final time. I mean, you kind of have to assume, at least from my position, because I took that off first and totally spaced that it has to be on there to do the check. You have to assume it's decent. You can see a lot of wear in the pump body bushing. That's normal. So that's why you always want to change your bushings in these transmissions and pretty much all transmissions. I mean, you know, there's a few that where you have a little bit of margin for error, but they are few and far between. I would say, unless you know different, or you know somebody that has a lot of time on a particular unit tells you that you don't really need to change the bushings, just assume you need to replace all of them. All right, looks like this band wants to come out. So when you put your band anchor back in, you're gonna have, I mean, this is kind of like an isosceles triangle. You want to have, you know, if you remember trigonometry from high school, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. You want the c squared side facing down, you know, facing the direct drum. All right, speaking of which, let's go ahead and remove it. And let's see how many frictions are in here. First, let's see what kind of clearance we might or might not have. 22 to 36 thousandths on this drum, and 22 to 46 on the forward drum. So most of the C6s, especially the later model units, have 3 frictions to the direct drum. This one looks like it might be a 4 or even a 5 clutch drum, which is what you want for anything performance oriented. All right, and these snap rings are selective. Again, there's like 5 or 6 different sizes. Let me see what this one is. Most of the time it's 75 or 76 thousandths. That's what I most commonly see, and this is no different. This only has 3. So 3 clutch. So yeah, 3 frictions, 3 seals, and there's no cushion or wavy plate in these direct clutches. So you got 80 thou thick steel, that is factory, you know, what I will call par for the course. To my knowledge, I never changed. So you can see Borg Warner. And what I'm looking at is these letters and numbers here. See if that's equivalent of a engraving. You see a little bit of heat here. So either this thing overheated at some point or there was some slippage. See, it's E4OD, so E4OD did not exist at the time that this transmission came off the assembly line, so this was overhauled at least once. 76 thou friction, and looks like we have signs of overheating in this clutch on all the frictions. So all my C6s get steel modules. I don't ever reuse the steels unless somebody's on like a super tight budget and they need to just get the thing back on the road. I mean, you see the heat there, a lot of heat. All right, the next thing that you want to pay attention to is the return spring configuration. So when I go to the foot press, get rid of the snap ring, and then we'll take a look at that and see what that looks like. And one other thing, because I just noticed it here, you see these locking bosses? You want to make sure that this snap ring is engaged on all four of them. I mean, this isn't the end of the world. The likelihood of this actually popping out because one boss was missed is relatively minimal in otherwise normal daily driving or even heavy duty. High performance, it's kind of a possibility. But make sure that you engage all four of them. So whoever rebuilt this didn't do that. All right, here is the springs, and I'll tell you straight away, this is not correct. There's usually 10 springs in these drums, or in these pistons rather, and they're usually grouped in two groups of 3 and one group of 4, where they're, you know, closer to each other. You can also tell that the springs are bent up a little bit. So we're gonna put a whole new set of springs in here when we go back with it. I have plenty of those, so no big deal. So the quote-unquote lip seals on these are not actually lip seals, they're D-cut seals or square cut seals. And as you can see, sometimes they can be stubborn coming out. All right, so here's our piston. As I was mentioning, these are square cut seals. I'll mess with it later. So these bushings may have been changed at some point in the past. They specifically don't look factory, strictly speaking. Alright, let's take a look at the band real quick. See if it's got any signs of impairment or wear. Okay, I think I did that on pump removal. Okay, this is just a factory level band. We're going to install a Rebestos Pro Street band when we go back with this unit. So forward drum. So this is your thrust washer for the direct drum. It goes here in the 4 cutouts, just like that. And then on these older model units, they had an axial style Torrington bearing. So that went right here, and it had an inner race, just like this. And the lip of the race faces the front planet. So the front planet also has a bearing. So you have this, and then it rides like this. And that's how it goes. Okay, and then you have a thrust washer inboard, but no thrust washer outboard. And I'm talking to myself just as much as I'm talking to you guys when it comes to thrust washers on the front planet. If you have watched my C6 rebuild series that's out there on the channel, I mistakenly put a thrust washer on this side of the planet, which is not technically correct, though. If you do make that mistake, or if you did watch my video, first I apologize, but secondly, it's not going to hurt anything, at least not in a factory application. So then you have your 3-tab plastic thrust washer, or actually 4-tab I should say. No, 3-tab. 3-tab, sorry. Getting my thrust washers mixed up again. And then here's your planet, same aluminum 3-pinion deal. Again, these planets are usually pretty resilient. I don't see them bad too often. Alright, I always buy a thrust washer kit for these units. I prefer to replace all the washers. That helps bring what might be excessive drum travel into specification and get it on the lower side of spec, which is where I prefer it. Alright, let's take a look at frictions. So 46 thou is considered the top end for spec, and 22 thou is what you want at a minimum. Any less than that, it's, you know, can get dicey. Let me get a pick. So these are selected as well, the forward and the direct drum. They both have selective snap rings of varying thicknesses. Some are specific to the direct, some are specific to the forward drum. So I'll flash a chart on the screen that shows you what those are. Alright, so we have 4 frictions, 4 steels. So let's go ahead and measure and see what kind of thickness we have. Now, in the early units, these frictions were thinner than the later model units. So these are 62 thou thick, later model is 75 or 76 thou thick. And that change occurred with all the others in mid 76. Alright, and then steel plate, I don't believe these ever changed. I think they were the same. So 80 thousandths. So let's take a look. Forward frictions are usually not burn up. Usually not, but this thing does show signs of slippage as well, at least on the steels. You see kind of the concentric wear pattern. A little bit of glazing, maybe, not necessarily slipping, but... So here's your backing plate, and then your apply plate. With the apply plates on these, you don't want to be tempted to stick this into the direct drum here as the backing plate, so you can add another friction and steel. The reason being is that these are not meant to take what I refer to as shifting torque. They're really designed to move only in one direction and kind of stay held and fast for long stretches of time in a given drive cycle. They're markedly thinner than the backing plates for either the forward or the direct drum, and you really don't want to try beefing up your direct clutch using one of these instead of, you know, something like an Alto power pack or a drum that is, you know, designed to take more frictions. You can machine the direct drum. If you have a machinist that knows what they're doing, they can machine a snap ring groove, so it'll go, you know, somewhere up here, and that'll allow you to fit an additional friction and steel into that drum. And like I said, Alto power packs You can fit a minimum of 5 clutches and steels if you run that kit. And I like those for anything performance oriented. Okay, for the snap ring here, they can be kind of aggressive. So we'll just take a screwdriver and see if we can work it out. So I'll have this one standing by as well. So all I want to do is get in behind it. Just get enough of a purchase on it so I can then get under it, prevent it from going back underneath into the groove, and then just work it out. And of course it wants to seat in the top groove. So this is your snap ring. It is also 75 thousandths of an inch thick. So superficially they look similar. The clutch snap ring on the left and the Belleville plate snap ring on the right, but you'll notice the wear patterns are distinctly different. Sometimes you don't see that. Sometimes you'll see one that looks plain. Sometimes it'll be less obvious to tell them apart. Alright, these Belleville plates, you'll want to replace them. So a new one will get installed. And this is fine to reuse. This is the little support ring. It kind of protects the aluminum piston from the actuation of the otherwise steel Belleville plate. Okay, so here's your forward piston, bleeder ball and the direct piston. We'll look at that a little later. And there is an O-ring here at the center of the drum, and that's what you're going to replace. There's multiple different O-rings that come in your kit, so if you're not familiar with these units, it just may be a good idea to keep the O-ring installed while you clean the drum. Just kind of put everything back. Alright, so the last bits in the case are going to be the sun shell and then the rear gear set along with the low reverse piston. Alright, so sun shell looks good. We'll talk about how to inspect it in a little bit. And then you're going to have your low reverse clutch pack, and then you're going to have your rear planet. There's a snap ring that holds it in place, and then there's going to be a on a traditional C6 with the output shaft still installed, there would be another snap ring right in here between the front facing rear ring gear and the output shaft itself, so you'd have to take that out. Okay, so this is where your roller one-way clutch is, and this will install clockwise, so it'll lock counterclockwise. And as long as it's spinning clockwise, locking counterclockwise, you know it's installed correctly. There's going to be 2 thrust washers on this planet, this one and one on the back side. And then notice how the snap ring grooves, the ends, are on the lugs here, fully engaged, and then there's a gap between them. That's kind of how you want to install it. You don't want it either side exposed, in the event something goes on and the snap ring pops out. That increases the likelihood of that happening. Okay, so here's the other thrust washer. And then you're going to have your rear ring gear along with the thrust washer that goes there. Okay, one thing about these planets is you don't want to give in a temptation to clean them with a whole bunch of solvent and then kind of zip them dry with shop air, because that ruins the pinions. And so you normally check these going like this and like this and like this, and you may find that after you do that, where there wasn't play or wiggle previously, there is now. you know, there is after you cleaned them like that. So just be aware of that. Something to look out for, like anything else. You want to know this stuff going into it if you don't already. Alright, we'll check all that stuff out later. Alright, now I'm going to pull the low reverse clutch out. We'll look at that, and then we'll evacuate the rest of the case, including the low reverse piston. And I'll point out the differences between the early and the late piston. Alright, let's see where I'm clocked. Nope. Looks like my ends are right here at roughly, your vantage point would be roughly 10 o'clock, 10:30. Alright, notice this snap ring is significantly wider than those in the forward and direct clutch, so you know you won't mix them up. Okay, so this has the original C6 roller clutch. This always gets replaced with an E4OD roller assembly. You never go back with the C6 version. And you delete the two snap rings that hold it in place, so it'll allow the E4OD version to seat in there. Alright, let's grab the low reverse clutch pack. I don't believe these underwent any changes of note. So you can have 4, 5, or 6 frictions in this pack depending on, you know, what submodel you have. So in these early units, there is no waved plate, you know, that circular kind of undulated disc that serves to cushion the engagement from park into reverse or from drive into reverse. But these frictions, they're, as far as I know, have always been the waffle variety, and they look pretty good. I don't see any overt signs of slipping. So Borg Warner, for stock or mild performance, Borg Warner is perfectly fine, and that doesn't just apply to this transmission. I mean, it's pretty much for all transmissions that take their clutches. You know, unless you're doing a real specialized application, these are more than suitable for a rebuild. Alright, let's see how thick these clutches are. Get that into focus, so 80 thou. And then the steel plates are 72 thou. What's nice about taking apart a core like this that's been overhauled at some point in the past, where all of the friction elements are in reasonably good shape, you know, we can accurately measure their thicknesses, so we can relay that information. Sometimes, you know, transmission comes in all burnt up, and I mean, that's nice for carnage, you know, it's entertaining, but if it's not, you know, if it's not suitable to gather this kind of information, then you know, there's a little less value there in exchange for that entertainment, like you pay a price, so to speak. So especially if you're new to the transmission family and you know this information is important for you, you don't already know it. All right. So the low race, or you know, low roller inner race, is held on by 5 7/16 of an inch bolts. Alright, so what I like to do is I'll just hold the race so it just doesn't flop into the case. And with these early low reverse pistons and return spring setups, all the springs are loose. There's just a cover plate, and then there should be bosses on the piston itself to locate the return springs. Alright, looks like I'm going to have to bring in a more robust impact. Somebody may have over-torqued these. These are only supposed to see between 18 and 25 foot-pounds of torque. So they should come right off. Yeah, it shouldn't take like a full-size half-inch impact to remove these bolts. Jeez. So we have our lube circuit. Very early C6s did not have this. I want to say in 67 or possibly 68, they introduced a dedicated circuit for lubrication to the low roller clutch. And prior to that, the thinking was that splash lubrication or gravity was sufficient, but Ford, I guess incurred a whole lot of warranty claims for failed low roller assemblies due to lack of lubrication, and so they went to a dedicated lube circuit. There used to be a kit available from Ford that you can use to install and retrofit any of these early cases with that kit, and what it did is it introduced the lube circuit where there were previously nothing there, and you just followed the instructions, and it kind of gave you the lubrication you needed. So I don't know if that kit's still around. From what I understand, it is long since out of production. Maybe there's some new old stock somewhere in the aftermarket, but if you have a really early C6 you're working on, you'll want to address that in some way, shape, or form. I mean, ideally you don't want it going back on the road without that dedicated lube circuit. So, alright. If there's any more in there, I'll grab them when they spill out onto the bench. Alright, now I'm just going to turn the case upside down. We'll force out the low reverse piston, and then we'll go ahead and remove all the shift linkage and the band adjustment screw. These rear bolts must have been on there with like 50 or 60, maybe 70 inch-pounds. Something ridiculous. And here's our modulator valve. I never ended up taking that out. So it goes in the case like this. I'll put it back in. Okay, just like that. And let me see if I can get my pencil magnet. So when this is coming out, you want to make sure there's no drag on it. If there is, then you may have to polish the bore. A lot of these valves show some scoring or signs of wear. If you have a particularly scored up modulator valve, you may want to replace it with a good used one. So this is the side that faces out, and that's where the modulator rod or stem goes. So you just make sure you put it back like that. All right, for low reverse, you're going to put air right here. Right here. It should pop out. Sometimes they get hung up. Yeah, this one got hung up. They're not as reliable when it comes to popping them out like this as the GM 4L60, 700R4s, PH350s, but you just kind of manipulate it and it'll come out. Now notice the check ball here. Okay, this check ball was relocated to the valve bodies starting in mid-76, so that's what you want to kind of pay attention to. And then here are all your spring bosses for your return spring assembly. Alright, notice the kickdown rod is still in here. When you go back with it, you want to follow kind of like a last out, first in model in terms of order of operations. So you want to make sure that you get your selector shaft and whatever other shift linkage, your D10 roller, rooster comb, parking rod assembly, and your kickdown lever all installed before you put the guts back in, because once all the guts are in, you're never going to get this thing back into place. So just keep that in mind. Alright, now that that's out, we'll go ahead and remove these things. So you go get a socket. That's 7/8. And the band adjustment screw is, or lock nut is 13/16. All right. This thing, excuse me, this thing takes between 30 and 40 foot-pounds. So there's nothing you have to do with the rooster comb and parking rod assembly other than check it. I mean, they're very rarely bad, but you don't have to disconnect it unless you have to replace either the rooster comb or the parking rod. There's a nut. And you'll have an O-ring that will come in the kit to replace the one here on the front side of it. And then here is your alphanumeric date code, so D72 truck Ford automatic transmission design office. Alright, now we'll yank the band adjustment screw. So first we'll disengage a lock nut. It's going to be 13/16. And that should be finger loose, but sometimes it's not. So we'll get a wrench. So 3/8. And part of the seal on the lock nut came off with it. This thing's rock hard, so this thing's likely been sitting in a junkyard for possibly 20 or more years. Who knows? Alright, selector shaft seal. Just a small pry bar, it's all you need. And it'll come right out. Okay, so the band levers, they also vary. This one is a B lever. So I'll put a chart that has a list of all the levers and their ratios. I want to say the B levers are 1.85 to 1. The A lever, which is the weakest lever, they're like 1.65. Then there are, I want to say F and H are the most aggressive from the factory, and then Sonic sells like an aftermarket FF lever that is even more aggressive than anything Ford produced. So if you're going to run an R servo or a Superior Tech Super Servo or some other very large ratio servo, you don't want to run the H, the F, or the FF lever, because if you do, you actually risk breaking the case. I mean, there's been numerous reports of cases fracturing because of wide open throttle shifts with hyper aggressive servos and lever ratios. So it's like kind of like an unholy alliance between those two things will conspire to destroy your case. So if you're going to run the servo, and I would prioritize the servo over the lever ratio, I would, whatever factory ratio is on there, and Sonex has a list of them that are, will play nice with their large ratio R servo, I would just keep that on there. There's no reason to get rid of it. Alright, this D10 roller, if you want to take it off, you can. If not, it's not strictly speaking necessary. It's 3/8. So I thought it was maybe 5/16. And we get an extension. Hands are slippery as hell. All right, so case is fully evacuated. What I'm now going to do is get that extension housing back over here so we can remove the output shaft and everything else from it and clean that up. We'll take the governor off, and then from there I'm going to clean all these parts and we'll get them all back on the table so that we can then go through a thorough inspection, and I'll show you all the different points of inspection that are applicable for this transmission. So I got to take the seal out of that thing. I kind of spaced. I should have done that even before I started the video, so let me do that off camera, and then we'll get the output shaft and everything over here so that we can take that apart. Okay, so I smacked the old seal out. This is what it looks like. Okay, here's your sealing surface, and then this is the inboard side. Okay, so you have one lip seal. It's not a dual layer. Maybe the newer ones are, but that's what the seal looks like. Two snap rings that hold this assembly into position. So here's your speedo gear. Then you have a snap ring that's inboard. Okay, right there. And grab the wrong pliers. But they might come in handy anyway. Or maybe not. These things can get stubborn. So they'll want to twist and bend on you. And these pliers are just about done. So combination of things conspiring to thwart my attempts to remove that thing cleanly. Alright, so here's the governor support. You have your 3 sealing rings, then you have your governor. Just make note, okay, the larger diameter portion of the governor is aligned with the notch in the support. And we'll separate those two things in a minute. Alright, so now you have a better view of what's going on in here. Let me get a different screwdriver. Using like 4 or 5 different flathead screwdrivers for this disassembly. Like I said, I've never been inside one of these, so this is new for me, so perhaps it's new for you as well. So if so, we're kind of discovering it together. And this thing is literally just too wide there at the bend. Okay. Alright, there's going to be an adventure going back in. As you can see, it's pretty thick. Let me get a measurement. Looks like it's just shy of 100 thousandths thick, 96 valve. See if it'll let me take it out. All right, so here's the bearing. All right, with these bearings, in most cases, they're okay to reuse. I mean, this feels absolutely silky smooth, so you can listen to it as well. All right. Everything else is more or less pressed on. I think this is just pressed in place, or it's retained by the speedometer gear. And I'm just trying to see if I can manipulate it off. I could probably press it off if I had to replace it, but for now, I'm going to leave it be and see what's available as far as replacement bearings before I mess with it. Because all things considered, a bearing like that, if it's readily available, I will replace it as part of the overhaul. But then again, if it's not, and it's in this kind of condition here, then I have no problem putting it back in. All right, let's go ahead and remove the governor from the governor support. So it's just 4 3/8 of an inch bolts. Alright, and as mentioned, you have your 3 sealing rings. So we're going to leave the sealing rings on both the stator and the governor support stator just so we can look at those. We did have some slippage in forward, so we're going to see if there's any indication that those rings are worn. And then, of course, here are your 4 bolts. Governor itself is a relatively simple mechanism. So you have your 2 valves here. I mean, you always want to take them apart to clean them, but as long as they're moving and you can feel the and see the little valves actuating, and that's always a good sign. Okay, so that's the teardown portion. Let me go ahead and clean all of this stuff off, and then we'll do a physical visual inspection of the parts components, and I'll show you what you need to look for. That won't take nearly as long. There's really not a whole lot to inspect apart from the obvious stuff, so it's just making sure I have a thorough accounting of everything before we adjourn for, the day. Okay, all the parts have been cleaned up, so we have them on the bench. In fact, I got parts on 3 different benches, or I should say the case itself is on a push cart. So we'll look at all the case components, show you where you need to inspect and what you need to look for, and then we'll take you to the case, discuss that briefly, and then I'll close with an overview of the valve body and talk through some of the changes and a few different kind of DIY mods that you can do for performance or heavy duty. Alright, so for the pistons, all of them are going to have sealing surfaces in here. So what you want to look out for is any indication of scoring or rough surface or anything else that might cut a lip seal or an O-ring. Alright, so for the direct drum, you got your outer seal here. These are square cut seals, and then you have the seal in the drum itself, and that is also a square cut seal. So same deal for the forward piston. You're looking for the same kind of things. The forward piston takes an O-ring, and that O-ring sits in the drum itself. And then you have your square cut seal here. Now, later model units, they went to a traditional lip seal there. Alright, so for your Belleville plates, both for the forward and the direct. Okay, you're going to be looking for any signs of cracking or fracturing. That's going to be pretty rare. I mean, something would have to be used in a really super wild application or just straight up beat on to the extent that would necessitate a replacement of the backing plate because it's cracked or broken. I've personally never seen it. So for the apply plate and the forward drum, these can be cracked. It's a lot more of an occurrence, relatively speaking, than, you know, finding the backing plates broken. Alright, the Belleville plate, I mean, you can inspect it, but you're going to replace that. It's not something that you would reuse. Alright, so low reverse piston. Alright, same kind of deal. You're looking for any signs of fracturing. Make sure that this bleeder ball is working. Okay, that's going to be your exhaust, or your bleed off. So when you're in a forward range setting or in neutral, or you know, this has to exhaust fluid so that the clutch doesn't come on, you know, just due to an accumulation of fluid in behind the piston. Alright, all of these have bleeder valves or bleeder check valves or balls, and you want to make sure they're all working. Alright, so as I get done stuff, I'm going to just kind of move it on down the bench. Here are all your springs for the low reverse. Alright, I just put them in a baggie to keep them under control. And the only check you're doing there is to make sure none of them are bent or broken. Alright, other than that, it's a fairly straightforward deal. Alright, so now we'll talk about the pump body. So for your pump gears, it's my recommendation that you just replace them. To me, they're consumable. They wear like anything else, and the area you really need to be concerned about is in the converter engagement flats. These like to mushroom out, and they get worn over time, causing imperfect engagement between the converter hub and the drive gear. And so, you know, that just kind of exacerbates wear to that drive gear, which then obviously has a domino effect for the driven gear and the pump pocket. Alright, now if you're going to reuse them, first you want to check the both gears for any signs of fracturing, any excessive wear in the teeth. Check the crests of the teeth, as well as the you know, the troughs, if you will. Make sure that there's nothing amiss or looking kind of sketchy there. Alright, and that could be excessive wear, chipping, pitting, anything that would indicate that the set is no longer serviceable or useful. Alright, and then same with the drive gear. Okay, checking here for wear. I mean, we see a little bit of wear here, nothing overly excessive, but again, on an overhaul, you want to replace these gears. So when you put the drive gear back into the pump body, you want to make sure that these flats are facing front. So we'll go in just like this, where the flats that come flush to the top, this side faces you. Alright, so like I said, just replace these gears. It'll kind of put the rest or preempt any concerns you have on put back. Alright, so the main thing with the pump body itself, when it comes to wear, is the crescent. The crescent likes to wear, and this is true of all such pumps that have this kind of design. So just make sure that there's no wear here on either side of the crescent. Make sure that the working surface here at the bottom, there's no excessive scoring. A little bit of scoring is not going to make a difference, but if you see, and especially if you can feel scoring as you drag your fingernail across, or you see deep ridges, then you'll want to either remachine or recondition this body or replace it. Check your threads. Make sure that there's no issues with any of these pump stator support to body threads. And then one thing I want to point out with respect to the bushing, okay, and this is true of the C6, the E4, D4, 100, and 5R110s, all these pump body bushings are directional, meaning they go in a specific orientation. You can't just put it in however. And how you can tell is the oil groove. You see how the terminus of the oil groove stops before the edge of the bushing? You want this terminus facing front. So this is the front of the body. You want this facing front so that oil can be routed back into the gear pocket. If you have it the other way around, then you're going to flood the front seal and possibly create a major leak there, all the while starving your pump gears. Alright, apart from that, you're just looking for anything obvious structurally, right? Any kind of damage, you know, anything that's more or less common sense that tells you, hey, I shouldn't reuse this pump body. Alright, the pan. These pans are usually, you know, pretty resilient, pretty reliable, but you'll notice there's some denting here. The one concern you have, especially with a shallow pan, is that the dents are in such a place where it will interfere with the filter pickup, and it'll kind of block off pickup, so you'll have all kind of issues there. These dents are very easy to remediate. You just pound them out with a hammer, no big deal. But you don't want to leave it like this, where, you know, if you're looking at the you know, the outward side facing of the pan, there's concave dents. Okay, convex is fine, concave is not. So we'll just pound this out with a hammer, maybe a body dolly, and it should be perfectly fine and good to go after that. But you don't want to leave it like that. And I put a magnet in all these pans. No RTV on the sealing surface here. Okay, you do not need it. Don't run a cork gasket. Run a composite gasket or a performance gasket. Sometimes they'll have steel inserted rubber gaskets that are reusable. You can run one of those. I don't know if they're available for the C6 or not, but that's an option for you. You'll notice some of the bowl hole locations are kind of, I guess, how do I want to say this? They're like this one here, they're like flaring upward. That's fine. What probably happened at some point in the past is somebody may have used a whole load of RTV on this pan, and then the previous builder got it. He had to remove the pan bolts, and maybe he went at it with a screwdriver and a hammer. As long as you do that at a bowl hole location, you won't have any issues because it'll reseal once you put the pan back on and torque down your bolts. Heavy duty high performance, I recommend just installing an aftermarket D pan. I like the B&M pans, they're great, add extra capacity. They provision, most of those pans are provisioned for the installation of a temp sensor so that you can run a mechanical gauge into your, into your dash or whatever, and you can get line of sight to what's happening inside the unit from a temperature perspective. Okay, next thing I'll talk about are the gear sets. Okay, so front and rear planets, you're going to do all the same kind of checks you would do for any other planetary assembly. Check your captured bearing. Okay, you have a race and then you have a bearing and then you have an inner race. Okay, make sure it's not making a whole bunch of noise. It sounds like there's, sand been poured in between the race and the bearing. Then, you don't want to reuse the planet, or you can have the planet rebuilt with a new bearing installed. Okay, otherwise, just spin your pinions, make sure they're not making noise either, same deal, and then go ahead and check them for side play. And then check them vertically, make sure that the play is not excessive here. They do have to have some travel, but it cannot exceed a certain limit. And offhand, I don't know what the limit is. I could just tell by feel if there's some sort of issue, and I'll just replace the planet. Check the housing, particularly the splines. Real high RPM, these can wear, but it's not common that I see these planets bad. In my opinion, the planets are not a weakness in the C6. Okay, and new thrust washers, you can install, or you can reuse the existing thrust washers if they're in good shape. So if you don't want to spend the money on a thrust washer kit, then maybe you're on a real tight budget. The old ones are fine to put back as long as they're in good shape, and as long as you are within your 8 to 44 thousandths drum travel spec. Okay, so check the rear planets, a 4-pinion deal. Okay, there's no splines here, but there is lugs. These are very rarely worn. I mean, they're more or less captured in the low reverse clutch hub. So you just want to be sure there's no cracking anywhere, no fracturing, nothing like that. If so, simply replace it. Actually, I put this up front. Okay, here's your front ring gear. Check your teeth. Check the area where the journal on the planet resides. Okay, a thrust washer kit will have a new thrust washer here. So you can install that if you'd like, or you can reuse this one if it's in good shape. Alright, check your splines here for the forward drum. Make sure that a good idea is to grab a clutch disc and just kind of run it along and make sure it's not catching here. If it is, then you'll want to replace this. Alright, rear ring gear, same kind of deal. Just check the surface, check the teeth. Both the front and the rear ring gear are removable from their respective bases via a snap ring. So if you only want to replace the ring gear, or you only want to replace the center section, where the in this case where the splines are, or in that case where the interface with the planet is, you can do that as well. Alright, sun shell. So main thing with the sun shells is you want to check the female lugs for excessive wear. If it's real worn here, you'll have a very noisy transmission. You don't want that. So I think they make heavy duty versions of these shells you can buy. But the factory piece, if it's in good shape, you can reuse it. Unlike the GM 4L60Es and 700R4s, this is not like a high failure rate item. Okay, check your gears for your teeth. Check inboard. You'll replace these bushings. All right, these bushings are both the same. So this one can go here or here. It doesn't matter. Okay. And then when you pull this apart, check your thrust plate as well. The thrust plate is excessively scored for whatever reason. You'll want to replace it. Okay, now I'm going to focus on the oil distributor, the direct drum, the stator, and the forward drum. So I'll just bring them into view one at a time. So for your oil distributor, the main concern you have with these is wear here, where the governor support sealing rings reside. And how you can tell is not necessarily by eye, but by running your finger across the surface and seeing if there is a notable transition, a physical transition between the wear patterns and the spaces in between. If the surface feels like undulated, if you can, clearly feel a differentiation, then you're going to want to replace this oil distributor. These aren't that expensive, like, I don't know, 30 bucks, 40 bucks at most hard part suppliers or online. But you want to make sure there's no issues with this thing. Okay, direct drum. So a couple things you'll want to pay attention to. One is going to be the sealing surface here for the stator sealing rings. Okay, because in between you have your direct clutch feed right here. So if those sealing rings are worn, or if this surface is wearing, then you'll have blow-by or leakage, and you will not have as much fluid go into the apply piston as you should, and the high clutch will suffer as a result. Now, I'm looking at these and running my finger. I cannot feel any grooves. I cannot feel any differentiation in the metal. So the drum is fine. Okay, the other thing you want to be mindful of is the band surface. So the best thing to do here, actually I should say there's two things you want to do. One, especially if you're going to be running a wide band, you want to make absolutely sure that the surface is not warped in any point along the circumference. If it is, you're going to have to turn the drum if you want to run a wide band. If you're going to run a factory spec band in terms of the width, then what you'll want to do is, you still want to check for that, and it should be remediated regardless if warpage is present, but it's not nearly as critical as it is for the installation of a wide band. I shouldn't say nearly, it's not as critical. So what I do with these, just to knock the glaze off and prep the surface for a new band, is I will go ahead and take 320 to 400 grit sandpaper, stick this on a towel, put a towel underneath, and then I will just go like this in one direction all along the surface, 3 or 4 reps, and then rotate it, 3 or 4 reps, rotate, and do this for, I don't know, a couple minutes or so, just until you knock the glaze off. Okay, the direct drum has a square cut seal down here, so that'll be changed out. And then you want to check your sealing surface for your piston seal. Make sure there's no scoring. If there's some kind of catastrophic failure in a unit, then metal's circulating. Sometimes metal will get up in here and it will score the sealing surface. So if you see that, and that's evident, but it's relatively minor, then you could take some sandpaper, and you're gonna have to really get this surface to a mirrory smooth finish. So something like finishing with 2000 grit or 2500 grit is what I'd recommend. But my recommendation, if that's something that you come across, is to simply replace the drum with one that doesn't have that problem. That is always the best route to go. You can try kind of DIY reconditioning. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Okay, and here's your thrust washer, and then your retainer and snap ring for the return assembly. I have to get new springs for these. There's 10 of them total. They sit in the pockets and they're staggered in 2 groups of 3 and generally 1 group of 4, roughly speaking. Get that out of the way. Alright, so now we'll talk about the stator. So again, just like the direct drum, you want to make sure that there are no signs of wear, no physical wear in the area of the sealing ring, where the sealing rings go for the forward drum. This is the forward drum. Okay, check your journal surfaces. Alright, they should be mirrory smooth. You should not see any gouging, any chunks missing out, nothing like that. Same with the casting. Check the working surface. The working surface should also be thusly smooth. There should be no issues. If there are, just simply have this chucked up on a lathe and resurface it all the way around, and you'll be good to go. Check your splines as well. Okay, very rare do I see this, being a problem area. Others may have experienced different. Folks that do a lot more of these than I ever will, they've seen the full gamut of everything there is to see when it comes to the C6. But in my own personal experience, the splines usually don't wear. One thing I want to point out with these 2 bushings in here. Alright, so you got a front stator bushing and then you have a rear stator bushing. Okay, these bushings go in specific locations. So it's not like when you pull them out of the bushing kit, you can install this one in the back and that one in the front. Technically that's incorrect, because they have different oil groove patterns. So you see the front bushing. I'll do the best I can. In fact, let me get a flashlight. That's going to be difficult to see. Alright, so you notice the oil groove here on the front bushing. It's more or less at a 45-degree angle. Okay, all the way down from one end of the bushing to the other. Conversely, the rear stator bushing has a notch in it, and that notch faces out. And the oil groove here is more parabolic in shape, and it goes kind of all the way around from one end, kind of loops up and then back down to the bottom of the bushing, or the inboard side of the bushing, I should say. So there's no notch in the front bushing. So just keep that in mind. And then our selective thrust washer. So when you assemble a unit like this one that has the fixed yoke, the bolt-on yoke and all that, you want to make sure that the extension housing is on, yoke is bolted in and torqued before you go ahead and install the pump, so that when you do your end plate check or your travel check, it's valid. Okay, forward drums, These can be problematic in real high horsepower applications. They like to crack in this area here, and this is true of the C6, C4, D4, 100s. So a billet forward drum is recommended for anything more than, I don't know, about 500 horse or so. That's kind of like my demarcation line. You know, maybe 550 you can get away, but anything that's going to see a lot of RPM, frequently something like a full race vehicle, you want to put a billet forward drum and a billet input shaft. That's just my recommendation. Okay, same things. You're going to check the sealing surface here. Just go all the way around. All right, you want to go a little bit slower than what I'm doing. I'm just for demonstration. You're going to have your O-ring here in the drum. Okay, this is the O-ring groove right here. And then you want to check splines. Make sure that these splines are not excessively worn. Okay, it's got a little surface rust from being in the tank, but no big deal. That could wipe off. Yeah, it just more or less comes right off. If you have a drum that comes in rusty, that sometimes happens. Maybe it's a core, it's been sitting out, it's got, you know, rainwater in it or whatever, a whole bunch of moisture's been collecting, or the vent valve on the top of the case was plugged or clogged and moisture is collecting. You can stick these in rust remover solution, leave them in there for like anywhere from a couple of days to a week, and see if that helps. The one thing about some of those you know, some of those products is that they'll etch the drum. At least that's what I've heard. But I use a I don't know what the name of it is, and get it at Home Depot, but if this was all rusty on the outside, I would stick it in there and leave it fully submerged overnight and check it, and then usually I can just wipe off the rust. And what little rust is left, as long as there's no pitting, then it should be fine. If you see a lot of pitting in these drums, anything cast, then you want to toss it. It's at risk of failing, especially in a high performance or heavy duty application. Alright, this is going to be your low reverse clutch hub, and we have the snap ring for it. So, you know, your ring gear and your planet for the low planet set sits in here. You just want to check these cams. Every once in a great while you might see a cam that's a little bit worn out, or overly worn I should say, and that would cause problems with the low roller clutch holding effectively. The other thing you want to do is take a low reverse clutch disc and just kind of spline it on. Make sure it goes all the way from top to bottom and it doesn't catch. And that's true for anything where you have a clutch hub and there's potential for wear at that clutch hub. You want to make sure that a friction disc will just move nice and freely from the top to bottom or front to back. And as long as it does that, you're good. Back here, I'll grab a reverse input clutch. So this is a bit dirty, but a little awkward going on, but the main thing is you want to see this. Okay, it seems to be catching a little at the top, but I don't think that's a big deal. That's just more or less me kind of cocking it sideways, I think. Yeah, that's what it is. I'm cocking it sideways. Okay, so that is the deal with these hubs. Okay, last items we're going to look at are going to be our inner race for the roller. So this should be a nice mirrory smooth finish. Scrutinize these threads, make sure they're not stripped partially or totally. This one was on super tight, so I paid close attention and ran a bolt down each and every one of these threads, and there's no issues. Everything just, you know, the bolt goes in just fine. Alright, scoring, cracks, you know, you want to make sure that there is no restrictions in this lube circuit here. Otherwise, your low roller clutch will be starved for oil. We already talked about the very early C6s that did not have that dedicated loop circuit and what to do about it. If I come across the part number for that kit that Ford made to, you know, kind of update those early units, I'll flash it across the screen. But like I said, I know about it, but I don't know anything else about it. I don't know, never seen it before. All right, output shafts, pretty straightforward. You're going to check journal surfaces. You can, you know, smooth these out, 800 to 1000 grit sandpaper, and that'll give a nice surface for bushings. You have your speedo gear, and then you have your bearing. Okay, like I said, I haven't had a chance to check availability for this bearing. If it's available, then I'll replace it, but if it's not, I have no qualms about reusing this one. There is a part number on the bearing, and it's 1307A, and it's a Federal bearing. Federal mogul, presumably. Alright, governor support, check splines, check surface here on the casting, make sure it's, you know, not broken. My hands are dirty, I'll wash them. So, I kept the sealing rings on because I wanted to look at them to see if there was any signs of wear to them. I mean, anything obvious. It's real hard to tell when you have normal wear, if, like, to what extent the wear may have impacted drivability. You know, you have to look at the frictions, and then you have to look at what may have been happening with the unit based on the accounts of the customer or whomever. And in this case, it's a Core, so we don't even have that. Okay, parking gear and pole. So these sometimes break. I've seen it in 4100s a couple of times. I've not seen it yet in a C6, but basically when people are parking a very heavy vehicle on a grade and they just simply let off, maybe the e-brake is broken, and they allow the full weight of the vehicle to slam the parking pole and parking gear, because it does have some, you know, kind of movement before it fully engages. That's a good way to break this. So pump the brakes and allow the weight to gradually come to rest so that you don't run into that issue. Otherwise, gear, you're checking splines, you're checking the gear physically, make sure there's no cracks, you know, anything obvious, right? All right, if you have the yoke in your possession, if it's a bolt-on yoke like this, the fixed yoke design, check here for wear, you know, by the seal, because if the seal has cut a groove in, then, you know, you're going to leak there. I don't know if they make repair sleeves for this or not, but this one appears to be okay. I mean, it has visual wear to it, you know, normal wear patterns, but I don't see anything that would concern me when it comes to it working as it should. And then lastly, your output shaft, just checking here where the bearing goes. If you have an output shaft that takes a bearing, make sure the pocket is not worn, make sure that the housing itself is not cracked. Alright, check in here, make sure that the threads are not boogered. You have your speedo port, check that set of threads. I mean, that's basically it for the housing. And then we have our 95 thousandths thick snap ring that holds the bearing and output shaft assembly into place on the extension housing. And that, of course, joins forces with that yoke. Alright, let's go over the case real quick. Not going to touch on a whole lot, just some basic stuff, and then we'll move to the valve body. Alright, looking at the case, there's not a whole lot you really need to focus on, just other than common sense stuff. So check all your threads, make sure none of them require any sort of repair, make sure none are stripped or about to strip. If you need to do a helicoil repair, now's the time to do it. Secondly, just make note of your band anchor lever code. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole host or list of different band anchor levers. All of them have different ratios. This happens to be B, and the main thing you want to keep in mind is that if you're going with an aftermarket servo or you have the factory R servo, you don't want to be using a band lever that is going to be super aggressive. So no F lever, no H lever, no FF Sonics lever either, because what'll happen is you'll have way too much leverage, and there's been numerous reports of that combination of oversized servo and just hyper aggressive lever breaking the case. obviously it's something you want to avoid. With respect to sealing surfaces, you're going to have your low reverse piston down in here. It's going to be difficult for me to flip this thing up to show you, but you kind of know what I'm referring to. Just make sure that there's no signs of scoring or any kind of damage in that area. Again, when you have metal passing through due to some sort of catastrophic failure in the unit, you know, little tiny slivers can get into places like sealing surfaces and start scoring them up. The other thing you want to keep in mind has to do with the bushings. So all these transmissions come from factory with two different rear case bushings. There is a sealing bushing outboard, okay, sealing bushing outboard, and then you have your lube circuit here in between them, and then you have your lubrication bushing for the output shaft inboard. Alright, now I always use a Sonex one-piece rear case bushing, and if you're going to use that, just make sure that the bushing surface with the oil grooves faces inboard, you know, into the barrel of the case. And you'll notice here, this has a notch cut in it to kind of help you indicate what way is the correct way to go. So if you install them backwards, then you'll have lube issues in the back of the case. And there's been situations where these transmissions suffer from lubrication failures in the rear of the case just because of either low on fluid or, you know, RTV, clogging a lube circuit, or just simple use and abuse, in that when you go to install another bushing, the case will not accept it. In other words, the bushing will pass right through the bore here. If that's a situation you run into, I'm not familiar with any aftermarket case saver type tools or, you know, repair sleeves. Maybe they exist, but absent anything like that, you'll need to replace the case. So when it's in this state, even before I paint it, I'm going to go ahead and install the rear case bushing just to make sure I'm not going to have a problem. Because like I said, I want to know about it now before I throw a whole bunch of paint on it. I mean, realistically, you can even do it before you clean it, but I prefer to do it afterwards. You'll know if that's a high probability or not just based on your initial teardown. I mean, if you see a whole bunch of melted and grenaded parts in the back of the case and it's obvious that there's a lube failure, then, you know, you may want to just try to knock the bushings out. And even if you have the appropriate bushing driver, you can just try to reinstall these pre-existing bushings to see if the case will take them without wasting a good bushing. Alright, so make sure that your sealing surface for your pump bore O-ring is in good shape. I don't think I've ever seen one not, but you know, you just want to double check. And then for your servo bore, again, same kind of deal. You just want to make sure this surface is nice and smooth as it should be. Make sure there's no chunks missing out of the area that locates, you know, both the pin bore and the return spring. Okay, check this bleeder here. If this gets clogged, then the transmission will retain moisture and it won't allow that moisture to vent, so you'll have an accumulation of moisture in the case and you'll see rusty parts when you tear it down. So if parts have surface rust on them and the transmission came, you know, from a vehicle, there's no instance where it was just sitting out in a yard or was otherwise exposed, and it looks like the rust has kind of been there for a while, it's built up, I would suspect this might be clogged. I've seen it in some manual transmissions where the little bleeder or vent valve is clogged and parts are rusting inside, and countershafts, gears on the main shafts will strip because they're, you know, rusting from the inside out, and you know, obviously that causes a whole bunch of problems. So anyway, the other thing is just make sure all your bolt hole locations for your bell housing to block are in good shape. Threads here for the band adjustment screw, the bore, the selector shaft's not all boogered up. Make sure the sealing surface is good, it'll accept the seal. I mean, like I said, a lot of this is common sense, so, you know, just more or less covering it to make sure I'm hitting everything that I should be hitting. And if there's something I'm missing on here, I'll annotate the video with it. Alright, now let's go ahead and move to the other bench, and I'll walk you through the valve body. And I mean, there's not a whole lot to inspect with it. There's one place you want to test with a back tester if you have that. And then there's just a couple things you need to be aware of when it comes to, you know, changes in interchange and all that good stuff. Alright, got the valve body all apart, cleaned up. All the valves are now spick and span. So we'll talk through a couple things when it comes to inspection. But for the most part, your inspection will actually take place when you disassemble the valve body and, you know, start pulling the valves out of their respective bores. So any valves that are dragging or worse, stuck or seized, you obviously know that you're going to have to do something about those bores. The usual method is to simply take bench buddies and polish the bores and then sand the valves. And you know, here you want to use really fine grit sandpaper. Most of your work is going to be on the bores themselves, not necessarily the valves, but if the valves have scoring and it's like really excessive, then you may want to clean those up. Other than that, there's a couple of valves that sometimes will come out without issue, but then they don't want to go back in. And this valve, the throttle modulator valve, is one prominent example. I've had, I think, 3 or 4 C6s that I've done where this valve came out no problem. In fact, it, you know, just fell right out of the valve body, you know, when you held it upright, but it would not go back in no matter, you know, what you tried to do. So when you have a circumstance like that, chances are it's because the bore itself is slightly out of round or warped, and or the valve itself got misshapen, and, you know, worst case, you'll have to just go get another valve body. So just be aware of that. I'm not saying that's like a common thing and, you know, you need to lose sleep over it, but in the event it happens, you kind of know what to expect. Alright, for most of these transmissions, it's prudent to install a shift kit. So all mine get, at minimum, the SK6 shift kit. So that's a Transgo kit, and it'll come with everything that you need to do what you need to do to affect shift improvement, make corrections, you know, common hydraulic issues, and you always want to pair that. You always want to pair that with an upgraded boost valve. I always run the Sonics valves, you know, valve and sleeve kits. There's going to be an early style valve, which is what you see here, and then there's going to be a later style or later design. So again, going back to that major changeover year, mid-76, that's when those changes took into effect. So I'll just run through the valves real quick, and then I'll, you know, make some comments on the separator plates. So here's going to be your servo regulator valve, your accumulator valve, your 2-3 back out valve, and little end plug. In some older model units, 66 to 71, there was also a 3-2 downshift valve and spring inboard of these things. So, you know, if you have that, then you know, now you know what it is. This is going to be your 2-3 shift valve, and we already talked about the throttle modulator valve. 1-2 shift, manual second, and your spring. This is going to be your what do you call, line pressure coast down valve, and then this is going to be your cutback valve. And over here you have your TV boost and your 2-1 scheduling valve, and then of course the aforementioned boost valve, the 2 springs, and the pressure regulator valve. So this entire lineup is different in you know, the first generation valve bodies versus the second generation. And again, that demarcation line is May of 1976. So you notice here on the PR valve, it has a step down spool all the way inboard. Later models do not have that. Right, the valve more or less stops here, and it's not as wide as this. Alright, and then for your boost valve, the boost valve itself is longer. So the valve and the sleeve combo, the valve goes in like this. Alright, you have a retainer plate with 2 bolts that hold everything into the bore. In later model units, they eliminated this and they went with a retainer clip that just engages the top of the sleeve, you know, when the valve body is facing up like this, somewhere in this location, and that is how everything is kept inside. So when we talk about larger ratio boost valves, the land that is being referred to is this inboard land right there. That's the boost land. So you would measure the diameter of that, and then based on what you have, you can order a larger ratio boost valve. So Sonex has several different boost valve and sleeve kits based on both year, your vintage I should say, or generation, as well as desired ratio. So you can get the stock ratio, which is fine for most daily driven mild to moderate performance, or you can go with the larger ratio boost, which is strongly recommended for anything high performance or very serious heavy duty towing, hauling, or extreme off-road type applications. So anything with like real big tires, lifted trucks, or Broncos or what have you, that are going to see some like serious use, whether it be, you know, on the street towing, hauling, working, whether it be mud bogging, whether it be, you know, on the trails or rock crawling or whatever. So anyway, that's kind of the deal with the valve bodies. Apart from that, they're very straightforward. There are some DIY mods you can do. So for example, if you want to just omit the spring and block the servo modulator valve, you can do that, and that'll basically remove all of the kind of gradual, I don't want to use this term, but like pulse width modulated regulatory apply, and will allow that servo to be applied much quicker. And then likewise, you can pair that with modding the accumulator valve by just blocking it inboard. Now, I've read accounts of folks putting pennies in this bore, and I think it's like something like 13 or 15 pennies, something like that. I've never personally done it, but if you're using a shift kit, you'll want to use just one large outer spring that they give you. Most of the shift kits will give you a combination of springs, and you can kind of tune it based on your application and converter stall and whatever preferences. But for firmer shifts, just either block the valve from moving using pennies or a slug or whatever, or if you don't want to get too extreme with it but you do want a little bit firmer shift, then just simply install the larger spring. And in Transgo's kit, they give you 3 green springs. Just run the largest green spring they give you. This cutback valve, its job is to, bleed off line pressure as the vehicle picks up road speed. So putting a check ball outboard of the valve can accomplish that same kind of deal, where you keep your line pressure at or near what it otherwise would be prior to bleeding off, so that you have access to line pressure at all times. So no cutback, in other words. Alright, I think I said everything I want to say about these valve bodies. Again, I showed you how to identify the year and the application. The diesel valve bodies are not interchangeable, as is with gas applications, so I don't know, maybe you can make them work. I've never done it, so I don't want to speak to it, but officially, as is, they're not interchangeable. Okay, spacer plate. Not a whole lot to discuss here. This is going to be a 2-3 feed, and this plate was drilled out to 110 thousandths, which is for a heavy duty application or a high performance. That's kind of a good size. Transgo's max that they give you is 89 thousandths, so for this particular build, this is going to be a moderate to heavy duty use, heavy duty use truck. It's going to be towing and doing some hauling, so I'm okay with this size. However, if the customer tells me, hey, it's a little too firm, or needs to be dialed back, then the easiest thing to do is just to swap the plate with something that's not drilled out like that, and that's it. I mean, these valve bodies come off. There's, see, 2, 4, 6, 8 bolts, and it's it's off the case, so pretty easy deal. Alright, and then the aforementioned changes to the reverse vent circuit. So you're gonna have, this thing, okay, you're gonna have your direct clutch check ball right here, and then in this area for the newer updated valve bodies, this general area here, you're going to have the low reverse check ball, and you'll have updated piston, which does not have the check ball and capsule in the piston itself. It'll just be a piston, and then the return spring assembly is a unified or captured assembly. It's just, all the springs are held onto spring bosses, and then there's a top retainer, like a more traditional looking one. None of the springs are loose, like what you saw earlier. Alright, I think we kind of boiled the ocean as much as I guess I'm comfortable doing in terms of the length of this video. It's certainly a lot longer than I anticipated, but I don't want to break it up into two separate vids because everything does flow together. And so, this is, I think, a very good representation of the process that you're going to go through when you take apart a transmission, clean it, inspect it, and get everything kind of, ready to go for reassembly. Less parts. I showed you one part, the servo, but the very next step from here is to get all your parts, get them on the bench, make sure you got everything you need, and then start reassembly. I typically start with bushings, and then I'll proceed to valve body, or maybe I'll do valve body first and then proceed to bushings, and then from there it's sub-assemblies, case assembly, valve body on case, and then pan, and that's it. Alright, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, go ahead and leave them below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you have anything else you want me to discuss or show in a video as it relates to the Ford C6, go ahead and put it down, and I will prioritize it as soon as I can. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day and or evening, and as always, thank you so much for watching, especially if you have watched the entire video up to this point. Extra special thanks to you.